All right, so I'm going to get started here. Good afternoon. My name is Gary Morishima. It's my pleasure today to introduce the sixth PSC seminar in a series on environmental change. The topic of the day is freshwater productivity in the face of climate change. Just a little reminder here, the session today is being recorded. So if any of you might happen to want to review the session again or miss part of it, the link to the recordings was provided in the meeting notice or the seminar notice. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes introducing you to the topic. First of all, we're dealing with a species that is anadromous, semmelparous, and has a high homing fidelity. And that means that there's a great deal of life cycle diversity. And a lot of that diversity and the productivity and abundance of these species is actually controlled by what happens in both the marine, but the freshwater environment has a big factor in it. So there are a lot of things that are going on in the freshwater environment, drought, floods, we see changes in precipitation patterns, temperatures, algal blooms, all sorts of things. But in the life cycle of the salmon, the vast majority of the life cycle and vast majority of the influence of the freshwater occurs, from the time that the fish spawn until they smolt. And key to all of this, of course, is water and the water cycle. And the water is influenced by many environmental factors, from the mountains to the ocean. I'm very pleased to present two speakers today, Chris Jordan from NOAA and Dan Selbie from DFO. They'll be going in this order. Chris is going to talk about biofluvial geomorphology and why does it matter to salmon. Chris has expertise in mathematical biology and modeling and systems monitoring. He works a great deal in salmon and riverscapes and decision support systems for restoration of salmon and their environments. Dan Selbie of DFO is going to talk about conservation and management of Pacific salmon futures in an area of unprecedented environmental change. Dan is a limnologist and paleolimnologist with expertise in trophic ecology of sockeye in particular. And he's going to really focus on the importance of embracing environmental change and how we approach salmon management. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris, and then Chris will turn it over to Dan, and then we'll be followed by a Q&A session. So Chris, you've got the ball.
Great, thank you so much, Gary. Thanks for this opportunity to talk in the series. It's an exciting chance to tell a story about fluvial geomorphology, which is a thing. And I've added the bio part because I think the biology and the physics really determine what a healthy riverscape is. And as Gary started in his introduction, that's what a healthy salmon populations need. So that's what I want to talk with you about today. But before I talk about fish, I want to talk about riverscapes. I want to talk about riverscape health. So clearly, we've degraded our streams and rivers and floodplains across the continent, across the planet. And we've done this through our land use practices. We've done this through urbanization. We've done this through overallocation of water and channel simplification, which result in pervasive degraded freshwater systems that are characterized by incised, that is dug down in ditches, simplified, that is a single channel, disconnected, the channel is not in contact with the surfaces, the floodplains that it historically was, river systems that are in poor condition. So what are we going to do about it? And what does it mean to fix it? And what are we fixing it to? That is, we have to have a target. We have to know what a healthy system looks like. So I'd like to go through this exercise with me. I'd like you to close your eyes. Well, if you close your eyes, you won't be able to see the slides. So maybe close your eyes in your mind or close them for a little bit and imagine a healthy stream system. What is it that you saw? If you saw something like this, I think you need to work on your imagination. But you're not alone, because this is the kind of system that most people would call up when asked to envision a healthy freshwater stream or river. But is this really as good as it gets? This is what riverscapes should look like. So it's time that we unforget. It's time to reimagine or sort of re-remember what natural riverscapes can be. What did riverscapes look like before all of that degradation, that simplification, that loss of complexity? This is a creek. It's a connected floodplain system. It's a wetland corridor. And this is characteristic of what riverscapes across all North America used to look like. You do see little pockets of these complex connected riverscapes, but now we think of them as oddities. They're representative of what the system used to look like, but not at the same extent. These wonderfully messy river wetlands are cool places when you stumble on them, but we think of them as a jewel, as this, we were lucky that we found these places, as opposed to just being bored that every place we looked was a river wetland corridor. So really then, what is the difference between this connected floodplain that I'm saying is a healthy riverscape and this, which I'm saying is not a healthy riverscape? And why can't we see it? Why don't we see it? And why don't we conjure it up? So what are the pieces that make a healthy riverscape? How do we help ourselves see these things? There's just three. There's three things that make up a healthy riverscape. There's space. So this river here needs space. And by space, I mean the floodplain. From valley wall, or from where the slope changes from flat to going uphill to on the other side. That's all belongs to that creek or river. And that river needs it if it's going to be healthy. It needs structure. Not like teenagers need structure, but it needs structure. These are physical things that are in the channel, and that structure forces complexity. So here's an example. Here's a beaver dam, and that is a piece of structure. And that's forcing all of this complexity of the channels that are upstream of that piece of structure. So that structure forces complexity. Now, structure, things that are in the stream or on the floodplain, their value matters and changes depending on where they are. So this beaver dam here can force enormous amount of complexity because this is a unconfined valley setting. Over here on this tributary that comes in a more confined setting, structure will matter and force complexity, but it won't look exactly the same, but it's still important. The third element of this healthy system, the system that has space and it has structurally forced complexity, is flow. And you have to have flow to be a river or a stream, but the healthy version of flow is inefficient flow. That is, it takes time for the water to move from the top of this reach down to the bottom of the reach. The water takes detours. It goes off to the side, or it goes down into the substrate below the surface and comes back up again. That inefficiency is a necessary component of the system, of the healthy system. It's also forced by that structure and that complexity. So the three components of a healthy river system: space, structure that forms complexity, and inefficient flow. It takes time for water to move through the system. This is what we call a biofluvial geomorphic system, or this is what I call it, since I made up the word. So what does that mean? Let's break that down. Why do I think a word is helpful in reminding us all these pieces? Well, the bio part. The biology, that's where that structure comes from. It's going to be vegetation. It's going to be beaver dams. It'll be a tree that's fallen in the system. That's the bio part, and it's necessary. The fluvial part is that flowing water. That's what does the work. That's the engine that drives this dynamic system. The geo part is the inorganic component of this system. So the substrate, the sand and the gravel, the boulders that are moved around and form fish habitat in some cases. Morphic, that's the shape of all these pieces. And system, that really is a system. All these pieces have to be there, and they have to be working together for it to be healthy. So when you have a healthy system, all the pieces are there, they're collaborating, they're making this healthy biofluvial geomorphic system. But when something is missing, the system is unhealthy or falls apart. So what is it? What are those, and what's the manifestation? How does that happen? And if we know how that happens, then we can fix it. We can go backwards through restoration. Most impaired river systems across North America are impaired because of a loss of one of those three necessary pieces, and that's this hydraulic roughness or complexity. Beaver dams, trees, even vegetation like sedges holding the system together, that structural complexity is lost and the system falls apart or it simplifies. So let's see an example of that. How does a floodplain change with and without structure? Here's Birch Creek, which is in the very southeast corner of Idaho. And this blue line here, this blue area, is the creek in its simplified degraded state, the way it was a few years ago. Structure was added. In this case, some beaver came in and they started building beaver dams. And each of these red lines is the location of a beaver dam. And that formed a healthy, complex system. That structure forced complexity, forced the water laterally, and turned the blue stream area into this yellow stream area. So there's much more area, the full occupancy of that space of the healthy part of a river system. So a simplified system can be complexified by adding that structure. And then the system itself solves the problem. And this is what we call process-based restoration, where we aren't trying to change the system by making all of the elements. We are letting the system make itself. Here's the energy, the flow. Beaver in this case, or humans, could add a little bit of structure, and that interaction of that structure and the space available and the energy from the flow makes a resilient, self-repairing system. So can we cause this change? So that happened because beaver moved into this reach, but can we actually cause that to happen? Can we use our knowledge of what a complex functioning riverscape is and build a restoration method or program around that? And the answer is yes, otherwise I wouldn't be here talking with you. But so let me tell you about that story. So I want to tell you about an experiment where we manipulated an impaired system to make a connected floodplain system. And our goal was to make a connected floodplain system because we know these connected floodplain systems are fish factories. They're climate change and climate mitigation adaptation gold mines. These are places where water quality, in terms of temperature and nutrient processing, water temperature modification and nutrient processing happens at a much higher rate. And these are natural processes that can be recovered from impaired systems by making these connected floodplain systems again. So let's look at what happened. Let's look at first just the, what in our treatment was to add mimics of beaver dams and encourage the existing beaver population to build more dams. So in this case, we had a simplified system that didn't have much structural complexity in the form of beaver or beaver dams. And our experiment was to make analogs of beaver dams and encourage beaver to be adding more structure themselves. So before 2009, it was the before times, and from 2009 on is the after the treatment. And if you see the number of dams in the whole system, we added dams and encouraged the beaver population to start building more dams. We went from tens to hundreds of dams in the system. So let's look at what the effect of that was. The inundation area, the amount of area of engaged floodplain, where that water was going from the channel to the floodplain, increased by a couple 100%. The length of the side channels increased by over 1,000%. And if we think of, and I said these areas were fish factories, that sounds magical. But in reality, by connecting the floodplains, we're really just at this basis level is making more area that fish can use. So expanding the capacity of the landscape by adding the water to a larger part of the landscape, not just in the simplified channel, but across the entire floodplain. So what does that look like when you add water across a floodplain? Here are some outlines of the water extent. And here's the top part of this figure is outlines of the water extent for one reach in the treatment area, and the bottom part is in a control area where we weren't doing adding beaver dams, though some beaver dams, which are the yellow dots, did come in because beaver moved in eventually. So from 2005 through 2010, when we had just started the project, to 2014, after the project was well underway, you can see an elaboration of the expression of that channel on the floodplain. And this is structure in the case of our beaver dam analogs or natural beaver dams being added to the system. That structure forced the complexity, and the complexity in this case was where the water was. And this is all just low flow. This is summertime. This is not just because of a high flow events. Spreading the water out, engaging more of the floodplain. And this wasn't because it was just a wet period, because you can see in the control areas, in the same time periods, 2005, 2009, 2014, there wasn't a similar elaboration of the surface. So there's a manifestation of that complexity from the structure, adding more area, adding more habitat for fish. I said the water was an engine to move things around. It moves the substrate, it moves sediment around. And as it does so, it changes the kind of habitat that's there. So here is a reach, and what's shown in this is a before and after adding some structure. The colored areas are the wetted areas where in that reach there's water. And the different colors are the different kinds of, whether it's a pool or a riffle or a bar. And some of those features are concave or convex. Concave, it would be a pool, and convex, it would be a bar. And those are and aren't good fish habitat. And in the before case, and here's each color is a different kind of those units. There's some kind of bars, but there aren't a lot of pools, and there aren't a lot of riffles. These are good fish habitat, both rearing and spawning kinds of habitat that are made by flow conditions that are forced by structural complexity. After the treatments, this signature, the distribution of the kinds of habitat changes. So in the pictures before, I showed you that the amount of habitat changes, but the quality, the kinds of habitat changes too, because of what happens to the physics of the water as those structural elements are added. So there are more pools, and there are more riffles and bars, and there are more transitions. These are feeding areas. There are more transitions or seams. And so the quality of the habitat changes too by adding structure, and that structure forces complexity. You can see this change from space. These are aerial images, satellite images of vegetation that's false colored. The green is wet vegetation, and the red is dry vegetation like sagebrush. Here's before and after. It's greener after it started because the water is moving laterally out of just the channel. The water is also being moved into the ground and stored, which is what also helps the greening up and the more vegetation. These are the elevation of water in monitoring wells in areas that aren't treated with this structural complexity and areas that are treated. And this is 25 centimeters more, a pile of water underground across the floodplain in an area that just has addition of beaver dams. But the beaver dams are connecting the floodplain. That water being stored underground changes temperature. So here is a reach that has 10 temperature loggers. These are the little dots asking what's the temperature every 10 minutes at those 10 locations over 4 days in the summer in July. And you can see no matter where you are in this reach, in this simple reach, the water temperature is the same. It's hot in the daytime, it's cool at night, it's hot in the daytime, it's cool at night. And no matter where a fish might be in here, they're experiencing the same conditions. Sprinkle a couple of beaver dams in, that's these purple dots. Oops, sorry. That's these purple dots, and the story changes. Here are 20 or more temperature loggers in the same amount of space, and now they aren't all telling the same story. A bunch of them are the water moving through that's hot in the day and cool at night, but one of them has the same temperature as groundwater, even though it's in the channel. And that's groundwater that's being forced out of the ground into the channel because there's a pile of water right here behind a beaver dam. So that elevation change in the water is forcing the exchange between the surface and the subsurface water, which is changing the temperature. And there's some arguments whether this changes the bulk temperature or not. Do beaver dams warm the water because there's a big solar collector here, or do they cool it because they're forcing the water under? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on where you are, which site, which particular dam you're looking at. But no matter which one you are looking at, this is the story. There's variation in temperature. There are warm places and there are cool places available at every minute of the day. And the fish make these decisions. Do they need to go digest? Do they want to go feed? Do they have to rest? They now have that temperature variability in which to choose to have good or bad habitat. So let's talk a little bit about fish, and then I'll wrap up. So in doing this experiment, we also measured the abundance and the survival of juvenile Omynchus, so red band trout that are also have an anadromous form in this watershed, steelhead. And so again, remind you that in this watershed, we were in Bridge Creek, which is in the John Day, which is in Central Oregon. We did a treatment of trying to encourage beaver dam building from the natural beaver population, but also put in some of our own beaver dam analogs or human-made abandoned beaver dams, and asked, what do the fish do? And what did the fish do is they responded very positively. I said this was a fish factory because we showed it's a fish factory. The blue areas are the treatment areas, the red areas are control. The left side of the figure is before the restoration and the right side is after. And this is the abundance, the numbers of juveniles each time we went out to count fish, and the survival. And when we tagged individual fish, what was their survival from one period to the next? Before the restoration, the abundance of fish per unit length or area was lower in our experimental watershed from our control, and after the treatment, it was higher. We had improved the abundance of fish by 168% in our treatment area. The survival, that is, are the fish actually in better condition, and not just more of them, changed dramatically too. They increased by 50%, and you can see that because the survival, and this is the 4-month survival, each 3 months, each time we went out to visit the fish, was it still there? That survival rate was lower in our treatment, in our experimental watershed than our control watershed before we started the treatment, and after the treatment, they were the same. This was a good quality habitat, and we increased the habitat of the impaired area up to the good quality habitat of the neighborhood. And the last thing I want to touch on is the sort of rumor out there that beaver dams are fish passage barriers. And I think that's just patently ridiculous, because think about it, beaver and fish have been in this landscape for thousands, if not millions of years together. So we, as well as lots of other people, have collected the same kind of data to show that fish, both adults and juveniles, don't have a problem of moving around beaver dams. And in fact, They better not, because the beaver dam makes the fish factory habitat. So let's just show that with some data. So here's our experimental watershed, Bridge Creek. Here's the John Day. Each of these stars is a place where we have a pit tag antenna. We put in an RFID tag in each fish, thousands, tens of thousands of the fish. And in the case of the adults that were coming back to spawn, they would enter the system, have to pass over some beaver dams. So this is before we started. There were 20 or so beaver dams in the system, then pass our last antenna and head up into the hills if they wanted to spawn farther upstream. So before we started, there were 22 beaver dams naturally in the system. 17% of the adults entered the system, went through over these 22 dams up into the higher parts of this watershed. After we worked there for a while and the beavers took over, there were 164 dams. Remember, there were 22 before, and now there are 164, a lot more dams. And still, a third of the fish chose and were able to pass 5 times as many dams and get through the system. So we confirmed what the fish have known all along, is that the beaver dams are not a problem for fish passage. So I want to end here just with a picture, which is a pitch, shameless plug, for an essay that I wrote with my colleague Emily Fairfax on thinking about beaver and what beaver do to watersheds across the continent. Really should be part of our climate action plan. We have been asked by our communities, our governments, to do something, and it's not really clear what all of us can do, but really it's clear what beaver can do. And so maybe one of the things that we can do is help beaver return to their position in determining what are healthy riverscapes in our neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And we'll move on to our next speaker, Dan Selbie from BFO.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to this diverse group. I've spoken to the commission before, but it sounds like we've got a very broad audience today, so I really appreciate the platform. I'm going to speak a little bit on freshwater today, but a bit of a broader topic, and I apologize in general to folks if this seems a little apocalyptic, but I do believe it's grounded in reality. I'm going to be speaking today mainly around the transformation of conservation management that largely the literature is pointing to. It's required to deal with the largest period of unprecedented environmental change in human history. And I'd like to acknowledge Bronwyn McDonald and Sue Grant of our State of the Salmon program, who have been colleagues and contributors on this kind of work and have really been spreading this message. I think sometimes as scientists we get myopic and lost in the minutiae, and we forget to see the forest for the trees, and there certainly is a forest out there. So generally, as a species, we've had a pretty good run. Left the Horn of Africa somewhere around 90,000 years ago, occupied most aspects of the planet. But it's really been within the last 10,000 years or so that we've seen a real expansion of society, expansion of complexity in human systems. And commensurate with that, we've seen a real expansion in the expectations of humans to exploit their environment. And that's been during a period of relative climate stasis. Last 10,000 years is the Holocene epoch, the period since last deglaciation, and it's been warm and wet. It's fair to say that we're transitioning into a new time era, one that has been dubbed the Anthropocene, the first geological epoch to be named after humankind. And, largely defined as the period in which human forcings have dominated the global system, the climate system, the biotic system, and in our case, the aquatic systems. And, this began in, following the Industrial Revolution somewhere around the 1850s, but really has accelerated through the so-called Great Acceleration post-1950, when a number of sort of critical processes were developed, like Haber-Bosch and otherwise, that allowed us to really control nature, if you will. And so this has led to a crisis of our own design, which is to say the climate crisis, which has been critically affecting us, but now it's really in our face, and it challenges our ability to manage natural systems, if we can even use that term anymore. So ostensibly, the previous point was talking about how the Holocene was basically a period of environmental stasis, which we developed our expectations of what the environment can produce for us. And now we've entered the Anthropocene, where we are dominating the biosphere. In apologies to American colleagues, the focus of some of the climate material here is largely BC focused, but the song remains the same through much of the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. We've seen unprecedented regional warming over the last century, much of which went unnoticed and certainly detected instrumentally, but has changed ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems in particular in manifest ways. The warming has been at somewhere between 1.5 to 4 times the global mean, which is pretty impressive when you think we're trying to constrain global temperatures to 1.5 degrees warming. It's also resulted in massive changes in precipitation, which of course impacts snowpack, hydrology. A lot of the warming's been in winter, so we're seeing systems move from snowpack dominated catchments to nivell melt to rain dominated catchments, and that's been a fairly significant change that is predicted to be ongoing. That's led our Prime Minister and many others around the world to recognize climate change as an existential threat, not just to the ecosystem services we derive, but to humanity itself. And when you look at that regional response relative to what has actually occurred so far in the last 150 years or so in terms of warming, no matter whether we address Paris goals or business as usual, which is the orange line, red and orange lines there, we're going to see pronounced warming in this region, and that will have impact on salmon and salmon ecosystems. In fact, if business as usual carries forward, they're predicting up to and including 8 degrees warming above baseline, which truly is apocalyptic. For cold water adapted species, which have been around for hundreds of millions of years in some incarnation, this is pushing the limits. We know in certain systems we've done that, but they are sensitive to these sorts of physical changes and all the chemical and biological consequences that precipitate from them. Sitting next to roughly the heat engine of the planet in the tropical Pacific, we see quite variable climate dynamics in the region, interannual dynamism such as El Nino, longer term entrained processes such as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation or sea surface temperature variations. And this internal, as well as internal dynamism, but based on global feedbacks and otherwise, this is becoming more variable and changing in terms of the fundamental circulation patterns, which will have feedbacks on Pacific salmon. When you filter that level of complexity and sort of taxonomic complexity through the lens of climatic complexity, and then the biogeoclimatic context complexity of the natal ecosystems of these species, it should be no surprise that we see very complex outcomes as a result, ones that are very difficult to predict, number one, for fish and fisheries, but also in terms of habitat change and where things can go under a climate feature. Mapped on top of that, of course, we've added myriad environmental stressors, which can be interactive, antagonistic, or even synergistic with climate forcing, such as denuding the landscape, adding pollutants, changing hydrology, etc. And so it becomes a very uncertain future for Pacific salmon under this context. Now, when I first started grad school, I used to present a slide that said something like, the past is a window into climate change features. And the reality is now, in a short period of time, we're in an era where the present provides a fairly good window into where things could go, probably on the low end of the scale. And so I'll draw forth a few examples in recent history. Last year, the hottest 5 years on record have occurred since 2015. And precipitated massive swaths of the Pacific Northwest and BC to ignite on fire. Some curious interactions with insect defoliants and other complexities that make this at a landscape scale transformative to hydrological regimes and otherwise that impact salmon in their freshwater environments, both rivers and lakes. And just to give a plug for Lytton, that was the famous little community last year that hit the record temperature in Canada and then burned to the ground within the day. So these are major changes that are not some specter of the future. They're occurring now, and they are having some level of influence, even if we don't fully understand it on salmon and salmon fisheries. Good example is the extreme precipitation of last fall, last November. A single series of atmospheric rivers, which nearly took out my lab that I'm sitting in, flooded the lower mainland of British Columbia and caused the largest, by economics, natural disaster in Canadian history. We are seeing changes in snowpack amounts and phenologies, rising water temperatures, all conspiring to change hydrological regimes for salmon, including low flow periods that do not permit passage, which were an issue on major watercourses like the Skeena in recent years. And also those sorts of major landscape transformation like fires are changing all the processes that John was just talking about, which is to say, or sorry, Chris rather was just talking about, which is to say interactions between groundwater and surface water, nutrient flows to and from organic versus inorganic nutrients. And in lake systems, we're seeing physical changes in stratification patterns otherwise that change fundamental underlying nutrient limitation regimes for aquatic ecosystems that support sockeye salmon. So these are fundamental changes that aren't part of the future alone. They're happening right now, and they're consternating our ability to predict fish and fisheries. In the ocean environment, we're seeing large changes as well. I mean, it's not now surprising that we see, major southern species intruding into the Northeast Pacific. The Northeast Pacific or North Pacific in general is accumulating heat at an alarming rate, as global oceans are as well, but at a rate that seems to be much faster than many others. And so this has implications not only for trophic interactions, for novel predators on Pacific salmon at any given life stage, but also, exchanges of nutrients from land to ocean, water exchanges from ocean to land and vice versa, and fundamental aspects of the circulation patterns of the Pacific, which we do know in coarse measure that Pacific salmon are responsive to. Key examples recently would be the blob that emerged in 2012, 2013-ish, which everybody said was this rare, case. Temperatures and surface temperatures were 3 degrees above average. Southern species moved north. Couldn't happen again anytime soon until again it happened in 2019-20, the so-called return of the blob. And now we've seemed to have been trained into what I think they're predicting to be a triple dip La Nina cycle, which is kind of produces very cold onshore conditions and might favor other groups of species. So real variability in recent history that is very extreme, and predicted outcomes of climate change, even if the magnitude of these things is coming in a little hot for our liking. And that's the current situation. The future predictions are for major change as well. I laugh because I presented this left-hand slide in several talks since I was a grad student. It's one of Dave Welch's old papers. We don't really talk about a 2 times CO2 world anymore for climate change, but the basics hold true, that there is a northern range distribution or movement of species. I maybe just read a paper that said it's on average 17 to 72 kilometers per year. That's pretty astounding when you think about how much geography there is to transit to the North Pole and how much time we have. In the freshwater environment, there'll be some opportunities as glaciers recede. The paper by Pittman et al. Shows that there will be X number of square kilometers of new habitat that will exist. But one can imagine, as climate change is a bit of a steamroller here, these environments too will evolve, be colonized, and then change again through a reasonably fast rate of time. At least in Canada, we still struggle to catch salmon. Some of that is by our own conservation design, by implementing policies that restrict fisheries. But the recent last few years is a 90% reduction over the long-term average. We're not catching salmon. And realistically, we are plagued by a number of challenges, both in the environment and in our own heads, that will be a challenge for managing and conserving these species in the future. Basically, number one, our window of understanding is exceptionally short. We know from paleoecological records that the range of natural variability in salmon production is much broader than what we've likely seen during the fisheries record, where most of our data comes from. There are natural forcings that are responsible for that, which we don't even necessarily really consider in the modern sort of management of the species. Secondly, the environment is not static. We may have gotten away with the Holocene being a period of relative stability. It's not to say there weren't civilizations that rose or fell based on climate variability, but we don't, in our toolkit, really account for non-stationarity in environmental processes, nor do we, fundamentally really understand how they work. And so when we apply our predictive modeling techniques that are predicated upon, past sort of data sets, that does not acknowledge or incorporate, this shifting underlying, foundations or assumptions of those models. And the result is, of course, increasing variability in fisheries and our ability to predict them, which in Canada, got us into a bit of hot water a few years back. We had an inquiry over it. It's likely to only become more variable as time goes on. And so, another constraint is the sovereignty of nations and space-based management. Climate and species do not adhere to sociopolitical boundaries. And you think about how those range expansions or range sort of redistributions are going to occur, it's going to create some significant challenges for the management of these species and their ecosystem. And who is responsible for those as they shift across political boundaries? State, provincial, federal. We also shoehorn ourselves into rigid social constructs and contracts. There's a literature emerging that indicates we should not really, under this uncertain future, be engaging in predict and prescribe fisheries, yet that is at the core of what we do. And so I think it's wise to listen to that literature. It has the best sort of internalization of climate features within it. And we will be challenged to meet, I think, international and domestic commitments that we do, make regarding Pacific salmon and their ecosystems. Perhaps last but not least are cognitive biases. And this is a really fascinating area of scientific inquiry in the psychological realm, that we really have innate human-based cognitive biases to changing the way we do business and to incorporating, sort of major, perhaps existential drivers like climate change into our work. And so I would encourage colleagues to pursue a little bit of reading in that literature to understand how that may affect you in your own world. I certainly have done that in mine. And so I think it's probably a time where it's wise to get the message out, because things are accelerating in terms of change. The magnitude and variability is increasing, and the expectation of salmon probably has never been higher. Yet, probably ill-founded. We need to change our paradigm. And that shift has to be towards adaptation. I mean, the IPCC is telling us this, national governments are telling us this, most environmental agencies are telling us this, that we need to embrace this change. The only certain thing will be change and uncertainty. So to do so requires taking a fairly long-term view. Most of the literature suggests an investment in monitoring that's well above and beyond what we do currently, and targeted in a way that allows us to find opportunities in the shifting landscape to promote protein sources for the planet, and obviously to conserve and produce Pacific salmon. Requires us to be nimble, requires us to compromise, and in certain cases, probably requires us to know when to quit. And that includes the conservation of species that are struggling, to reevaluate that context. And this is perhaps best put forward, by Holling and Meff in the 96 paper, that ecosystems aren't static, they're moving targets, and they have many features that are possible. Our actions obviously dictate that, but they're going to be uncertain and unpredictable. Ecology has never come together with a grand unifying theory like any of the other disciplines. So I borrow heavily on my colleague Dan Schindler's recent couple papers, and his co-authors, John Moore, who I know and work with, and Ray Hilhorn, both published in Science in the last number of years, who are talking very, very specifically and broadly on these topics. Basically made the point that future resource use and conservation will be different than it is now. That's a certainty. but the composition, the nature of that, what ecosystem services can be derived from it will be highly uncertain. That change is inevitable is absolute. Adaptation is the only pathway to mitigating human impacts and ecosystem impacts associated with that, and resisting to do so is futile. In fact, it potentially sets us up to be maladapted to the long-term consequences of climate change for natural systems. So our conservation largely has to be forward-looking, and that's not something we typically do. We tend to manage in season, we tend to manage in short-term blocks, we tend to manage in spatial and temporal components that are relevant to us, but we really should be thinking quite a bit further ahead, is what the literature is indicating. And managing for things that we don't currently manage for. Currently, we manage for populations or communities, and these are kind of holistic or static entities. But you know, the argument is for fluidity, for connectivity, for heterogeneity, and these are broad concepts, but scaling from genetics to ecosystems to maximize the potential future options that may be available to ecosystems and humanity in the future. And so in so doing, many of the things that Chris was talking about that promote resiliency in ecological processes, say in freshwater and the marine environments, are what should be tackled, should be focused upon to increase that resilience, increase the options that can evolve in a warming world. And so rather than predicting and prescribing fisheries, and this is the central thesis of Schindler and Hilborn in 2015, we need to be thinking much more broadly about the range of scenarios that could be outcomes from this, predicated in the inherent uncertainty, to develop basically flexible and yet robust policies with options that allow us to reverse course if we have to change course, but that are intimately rooted and grounded in science and targeted monitoring, which are things that we have divested of internationally for some time in certain jurisdictions, and that's not boded well. So to come back to a central thesis of the talk, climate change is the elephant in the room. It is a steamroller that is creating infinite complexity in ecological systems, the planet. It is an existential crisis, and I think the fact that it's been this long-term specter for a long time means that we have an innate bias towards addressing it in many ways. And so we should all basically try to find a way in our own particular vocations and lives to affect change that pushes in that direction, and incorporate these concepts as not just some faraway problem, but something that's actually right in front of us and is actually kind of an iceberg for the Titanic. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and Dan. You've given us an awful lot to think of about. Over the last couple hundred years, we've actually moved from a system based upon abundance to one of scarcity, and we are facing some rather formidable challenges. You've given us an awful lot to think about. Whether we can actually reverse some of the changes we've seen or restore the functionality of some of our riverscapes. We're about ready to move on to our Q&A session. So I'm going to turn it over to Marissa and Mickey, and they're going to tell you how we're going to manage our Q&A session.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you to both of our speakers. So just so we can allow the audience the opportunity to pose questions, we're going to take a break of just a few minutes. So it is 2:52 now, so we'll reconvene at 2:55. And for those audience members, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box, and we encourage you to submit your questions, and we will resume in just about 3 minutes to start the Q&A and hopefully some great discussion. So welcome back, everyone, and speakers. We hope you're available to begin the Q&A session. So I am looking to the Q&A box, and our first question comes from Nick Brown. And I think this is directed to Chris primarily, but This is probably too obvious, but shouldn't water be an essential component of a healthy river system? Perhaps you can speak to whether hydrological droughts can be present in healthy river systems. So Chris, over to you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick. I'm in defining the healthy or impaired watershed. There's assumption that there's water in the system, and really, I was thinking about when I said the major form of impairment is a lack of structural complexity. And that's because usually when small river systems, and to some extent large river systems, are modified by people, we modify them into conveyance devices. You know, they were for splash damming, logs, moving logs. They were for transportation highways before, road networks could be built. And so inefficient conveyance which is a healthy system, was a characteristic that needed to be modified. And so one of the first things that were modified about river systems, and also so moving water that's going to be used for irrigation or in urban settings, that water needs to be moved from its sources in the headwaters and to where it's diverted or collected. And in that case, streams are turned into ditches, and they tend to be straightened, moved off to the side of floodplains. And that's probably the most pervasive. Clearly, water withdrawals and the volume of water in the system can take the healthy system and make it unhealthy. But where you've got the land, you've got the water, you can still have very impaired systems, and that tends to be a lack of structural complexity. Droughts are part of the natural, hydrocycle, even though by changing the land temperature, we are changing the dynamics of the water cycle, and we're changing the severity and depth and frequency of droughts, and that's going to have an effect on the physics in the river. But in that sort of natural cycle of water moving downhill because of gravity, we end up getting, our modifications put more of it in the channel, less of it in the groundwater, and more of it in fast moving simplified channels to get it to some beneficial use, we call it, farther downstream, as opposed to its beneficial use by being slowed down and doing nutrient cycling and all the processing that would do if it were left alone. But yes, I agree. And I was thinking of a particular form of impairment, which is most pervasive in terms of how humans have impacted riverscapes. Good point.
So now we have a question for both Dan and Chris, and we'll take the time for Chris to start and then Dan second. How does an enhanced system like sockeye, like in the Skeena, react in a year like 2022 when we potentially have an overescapement into the system? Does it hurt wild stocks or even see a collapse of the enhanced stock as well?
I think Daniel had a great slide and a great point around, we think about the natural world based on our experience, and our experience is pretty short as individuals, and then even sort of our recorded history of it in the concept of like ecological science. Clearly, traditional ecological knowledge has tens of thousands of years of depth of knowledge. But if we're thinking about it from, okay, what's the ecology of salmon from a Ricker perspective, we have a really short time record of that, and so we have a really weird view about what is normal. And biology has in a resource exploitation framework looks really wasteful. There's all this excess production, which we have figured out how to skim off the top, and that's our extraction. But so what looks like an overproduction year is which should be in the long record, perfectly within natural range. And while it may seem like that was wasted reproduction in terms of converting those adults to adults in the next generation, that's still fixed carbon and nitrogen that's coming back into the system, that is being exported downstream. It's being extorted uphill by bears and others. And so it's part of the long-term natural world. It's an outlier in our imaginations, and it's an outlier in how we think about managing it. And so, yeah, there are those impacts that you talk about in terms of an expectation of production of a system, even a relatively intact one like the Skeena.
Thanks, Chris. Just to follow up on that, Babine Lake is the only enhanced system within the Skeena River Basin, right? So it does have the world's largest sockeye salmon spawning channels. And so the question regarding the Skeena is a bit more broad, but in terms of Babine Lake especially, I mean, the productive capacity of that system has varied through time. We know that our work looks into that. So, you know, there has been some stability, I would say, be put into the system by enhancement. And so when you think about, you know, the interplay between top down versus bottom up foresting here, you know, density dependence versus what John was talking, which is the good marine derived nutrients that are coming back in the system, or salmon derived nutrients. That line is very fine, right? And it varies depending on the system and depending on the year, unfortunately. So not 100% sure how to answer this one. I would say I know that the residence time of this system is about 18 years. So, you know, one pulse of nutrients in from one cohort of salmon is not going to tip something in terms of a changing nutrient limitation. Probably is a benefit to the system to some extent, but all those hungry mouths, were they to exceed productive capacity for the system, could have feedback. I mean, we see it in Alaska with delayed density dependence when we have, you know, over 2 times S max or maximum, you know, predicted spawning in a row. We see depression in the system. These were likely natural mechanisms of population regulation in these types of populations in the past before there were ever fisheries. Here in your particular instance, we've added to them by enhancement, so it's a bit more complex.
Thank you, Dan and Chris. So I have a question that is not being posed on the Q&A chat because it comes from Gary Morishima. So first off, for Chris, Gary's asking, one of the main challenges confronting restoration is that the human population occupies lower reaches of riverscapes, so development, agriculture, that type of thing. What can be done to restore ecological functions in those areas?
We might have to learn how to share. We might have to give back. There's a really cool movement that started in New Zealand, thinking of rivers have rights. And there's others, the idea that the river has a water right as well. So Western US water law is really obscure, convoluted thing left over from colonialization of the land. I got there first, all that water's mine. No, it's not. But there's a legal structure, and changing that legal structure is going to be really hard. So is there a workaround to get there? And one of the workarounds is, can you adjudicate a water right to the river? And that sort of minimum in-stream flows is the way we talk about it from NOAA's perspective, a regulatory perspective. Is there a way to do that? Similarly with the space, if healthy riverscapes need space, and we find really convenient that flat space that rivers have made over millions of years for our infrastructure, for our development, for our agriculture, which means we've taken it away from the river. And so is there a need societally to ask that question? Can we have the functions? And this is kind of the point of that paper I pointed to at the end, is like, how are we going to do this climate mitigation and climate adaptation work if the structures that make a resilient world around us are natural structures? And if one of those natural structures are natural connected floodplains, we're going to have to make space for natural connected floodplains. And so yeah, there's going to have to be a compromise, Gary. There's going to have to be some hard decisions made. And I think, as Daniel said, maybe we get to the point of saying, well, I guess we don't want salmon because we're not willing to give up this floodplains, right? And that's where the connections have to be made, as opposed to, oh, we're not going to have salmon, therefore the fishers have to give up salmon. Everything's going to be net pens. So we're not actually giving up salmon. But what we are is giving up all the other things that come with having natural salmon production, which are these riverscapes that give us resilience to wildfire, that give us water security. Oh, and by the way, they also give us salmon. You know, so what are our value system, and how do we build that value systems into moving forward under all the things, you know, the doom and gloom that Daniel, the reality of that pointed out, that this is what's happening, and it's happening to us fast. And it's within our control right now to do something. But these are hard, big choices. And when are we going to start talking about them?
From a Canadian perspective, the Fraser is a good example of this. The majority of the people in British Columbia live in the lower mainland, which used to have large connected lakes like Sumas Lake, which was drained in the 20s, which used to have untold sloughs and backwaters that fish reared from top to bottom in the watershed, popped down from upstream populations that would rear there prior to going to the ocean. These things are known to, you know, if they were to be reinstated in some way, it's difficult to do, of course, because people live there now, would improve futures, right? So there's actually a paper recently in Journal of Ecological Applications by Chalafour et al. In 2021 that evaluated this using, I think, threat management and ecological evaluation. And interestingly enough, they explored a good, in the Lower Fraser, explored a good variety of options from fisheries management decisions through habitat, habitat approaches, changing pollution, hatcheries, variety of the levers that we think we have control over. And it turned out that the one thing that would push populations back, at least based on the assessment they did, towards positive trajectories for the populations was investment in habitat resiliency and habitat restoration. Again, that's a loaded term because you got to have a reference point, but the improving habitat, and that included also connectivity issues that were just mentioned there. So there's a companion paper that also talks about how much of those creek courses and river courses were lost as a function of erecting those non-natural, pieces in the landscape. So I draw people's attention to that. There is hope to this, even in the most dense landscapes, to see success stories and to build some of that resilience in absentia of urban heat island effects and other, runoff problems. But yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. This is a question for Chris, I believe. Has anyone yet demonstrated that stream restoration, like that associated with encouraging beaver colonization or spread, actually results in more fish? That is, not just attracting fish to the sites, but actually more fish in the whole system.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. I call stream habitat restoration a fad. Fish attracting devices, and that's most things, like wood jams. That if there's no cover in a system and you put in some logs, magic, I made coho. No, it's the only place that there's for those fish to hide from mergansers or kingfishers. But on the watershed scale, which is why folks got together and sort of came up with this idea of doing these watershed scale experiments. We call them intensively monitored watersheds, IMWs. To do it at the scale where you'd expect a population response, not a redistribution of individuals. And there was recently a nice summary of a 15 or so of these watershed experiments been running for the last almost 2 decades. And the Bridge Creek one that I showed you is one of those IMWs. It's in that summary. And about half of the project showed an increase in abundance, not just redistribution of these same individuals, but an increase in abundance year after year. Increases in survival, seasonal or annual survival, but only for juveniles, unfortunately. And this is primarily, these restoration actions are around rearing habitat. So making more rearing habitat increases the fish density in these areas. But they are still, even though they're watershed scale experiments, they're still done at small enough scale that they're really not making a detectable effect on the adult population. So even though in the Bridge Creek project we had a nearly 200% increase in per unit area, the number of juveniles, the number of adults that we would expect to have come back was the change was within our detection ability and the annual variability of the steelhead run for the mid-sea, the John Day population that was coming to the middle Columbia ESU. So no, none of those projects have demonstrated an adult population change. But I think that's not because they don't work, that they're making individuals that just die as soon as they leave the experiment. It's because the scale of the work, that these are experiments that are a small subset of all the restoration work that's done in a way that's being monitored and monitored intensively enough to see the changes in juvenile abundance, but that's still a drop in the ocean when it comes to changing the numbers of adults. And the years later, after the ocean year, residence time, that the fish would come back and all the other things that happen, all the other population processes. So I'm still encouraged. I still think it works. I still think we're doing the right thing. But I think what we should be doing is not saying we're demonstrating the change in population process at the whole population, but we're demonstrating that we know how to do it. Now we have to scale up those worthwhile actions to the landscape scale that would then manifest itself in adult abundance impacts. That said, if you take out a big dam like the Elwha, you get more adults. There's no doubt there. And that's just the scale of that magically huge project. But all the other sticks and stones projects, we're not at anything like that scale.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think, that IMW synthesis paper really recognized that out of basin factors like, the 4-H's, harvest and climate change, and really can offset some of the benefits that you get from freshwater restoration. But certainly others like Tim Beachy have indicated that barrier removal, like the Elwha Dam, can have some of the largest bang for your buck in terms of bolstering salmon population. So next question, again, we have one from Gary, and this is for Dan. So Gary is asking if you can elaborate on one of the terms used in your talk, space-based management.
Well, how do we manage fisheries? We manage them based on areas. We manage them based on sovereign nations, and we manage them based on treaties between two nations. So that's what I mean by space-based management. And if you think about the underlying shifting baseline of where species are in space and time, soon they won't be in those areas anymore. So it becomes a very complex, sort of landscape to then navigate, right? Look at how long it takes us to negotiate international treaty, let alone how fast species are moving.
Thanks, Dan. This is a follow-up question for Dan. You suggested that flexible policies might be a solution to climate variability. Could you expand on that topic? And is it the case for some systems and species that we're past a tipping point?
Almost certainly so. The latter point is true. And we will not win all climate change battles. We will not preserve all species. I think it's a fallacy to believe that we can overcome some of these major drivers given the thermal inertia of the upper atmosphere and what it's going to do to the landscape and the water. That said, there are many, sort of foci out there we can latch on to and invest in that will allow us to promote the largest likelihood that we will have these species in areas that we care about anymore. What was the first part of the question there?
The first part of the question was that you suggested that flexible policies might be a solution.
So if you read those two papers, and they're kind of high-level reads in science, so they're digestible to most people. The issue here becomes we're then chasing protein, and so they don't explicitly say that, but as southern species move north, the prescription is to switch from salmon to something else. And that may be hard for us to conceive as people that have devoted our lives to salmon or to catching salmon or to eating salmon. But it's likely that we need to diversify our portfolio in terms of protein of marine fishes. And that's what basically the focal point of that is, being flexible enough to switch gear, to switch focus of species or communities, and also to be able to recognize when to stop that, right? Like, think about the hardship in fishing communities when the fish don't show up. So
thanks, Dan. So there's a comment, I'm not sure from John Lamont whether it's a question or not, but it's in the Q&A box, and it says, I know this is a freshwater environment we're discussing, but how about the marine environment, and will there be another session? And while that's not a direct sort of question to be posed to you, that's a great opportunity to remind the viewers that our next seminar series in the series, seminar number 7, is going to be on this very topic. So it's going to be changing productivity and sort of the marine factors, competition and other things that are affecting, along with environmental change, stocks in the North Pacific. So, and from the U.S. side, we're going to have Jan Olberger from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then from the Canadian side, we're going to have Brendan Connors from DFO speaking to those. So just a plug for our next seminar series there. We don't have any other questions on our Q&A box right now, but there's one other question I have perhaps for you, Dan. So Chris provided some excellent examples of restoration work in the John Day system, Beaver Dam analogs, and those effects. So could you speak a little bit, Dan, about some of the restoration techniques that are being used to mitigate sort of habitat degradation in the Fraser in particular that affects sockeye?
Yeah, in fact, in the upper river where there have been a lot of fires, this is kind of the jurisdiction of both our resource restoration unit within DFO, but also the province gets heavily involved. A bit of a complex jurisdictional oversight on salmonids, let's say. And so some of the work Charlton Van Geloven has been doing in the northern watershed around stabilizing erosion in certain river courses. I don't know that it's been explicitly followed up in terms of a fish productivity response. And I do want to highlight the fact that what Chris was showing, and I've seen this in several AFS meetings now, the level of intensive study that you require to understand whether there's been a benefit from these sorts of projects is large, right? And so, and it's required, right? Especially when you're spending the kinds of dollars that are required to do this kind of work. What I would also say is that DFO is embarking on a bit of a transformational exercise. Some may have heard of it. It's called the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative. And featured prominently within that is an expansion of restoration. In fact, creating, I believe, a center of expertise for restoration of salmon ecosystems. And so I think that there remains a lot to be seen, given that we are in a state of shift as to how that'll play out. But all the things you've heard today, I think, are germane to how those applications come forward. Not just thinking now, not just thinking temporally in space and time of processes, say on a seasonal cycle, on an annual cycle, interannual cycle, but thinking about what benefit will we get from these types of activities in the longer term? What's the sort of run of the impact of these projects? And then, we really need to prioritize, because ultimately the dollars and the cents may be flowing nicely now, but it may in fact not be enough, or in the long term, much more is going to need to be invested. So I think there's an opportunity to both learn from, these sorts of projects. I think we've got a long history of throwing sticks and stones around and not knowing whether it had benefit. But it's really becoming an accomplished science, which is really nice to see, and it should be at the root of where things go in terms of trying to build that resiliency in salmon habitats and freshwater anyway.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that answer to the question. This is a question for Chris. In the process of restoration to healthier ecosystems, are we creating artificial refugia where salmon don't have to adapt to the changes experienced in other reaches of the river system or the broader marine environment?
I don't think so. I don't think we can hope evolution that fish will adapt to bad river conditions. That we're providing enormous selective pressure, but not on something that there's genetic variation for them to respond to, right? So that's how evolution works. And while we might be killing a lot of fish, which is the source of that selective pressure, I think we're not necessarily working on something that they have an ability to respond to, and possibly pushing too fast, that there isn't time for that response, even though there have been some examples of pretty rapid evolution in salmonids. So I do think because of all the climate change effects that Dan pointed to, we don't have a lot of time to even give fish a time to rebuild populations and maybe recover some form of the genetic variation, so they have the raw material to work on as the range shifts north. So I don't think we should use that as a reason not to do restoration. I do think that there are some hard choices to think about in terms of at southern edges of ranges. You will spend a lot of time building restoration where you expect generations of biology to be required to have the payoff that you want. If the world has moved in that meantime, then it's not in the range anymore. So was that the right thing to have done? As well as the question we had before about just the feasibility given the built environment in those places. But I do think that's not a reason not to do riverscape restoration, because of all the other things, all the other benefits. We call them ecosystem services, if you want to be geeky about it, but just the value of those watersheds across all these different reasons. So wildfire resilience, and wildfire, frequency and magnitude is being affected because of our history of land mismanagement in terms of our forests, overstocking, changes uniform, seral stage, uniform species. We're making a more fire-prone landscape. If we can go back and make it a less fire-prone landscape, oh, that's a resilient landscape. Oh, that's a climate resilient landscape. Oh, that's the basis on which healthy watersheds sit in that. So fixing something for salmon, if that's what gets you out of bed, you're also going to help the water and the fire, issue. But if it's fire that your community is most worried about, and you go after process-based natural solutions, you're also going to be helping the watersheds for fish. And so this is the beauty of almost magic of these process-based or nature-based solutions. The natural world has resilience to all this variability in it, and mostly what we have done is remove that variability, because we love stability, we love predictability. I want that stream to be there because my road is there. I want the water level to only come this high because my house is there. That is our view of how the world should behave to be convenient for us. That is coming back to bite us now because of climate change, because it's going outside the range that we've designed for stability. But that natural resilience exists, and we're trying to return that natural resilience. So I think we should think of more reasons to do it rather than reasons not to do it, because of the benefits that we don't even know yet. But there's a long list of benefits that we do know.
Thanks, Chris. And this next question, again, it's from Gary, and putting it out there for either speaker, kind of a nice transition, but any comments on the concept of strongholds? So habitats or genetic?
I think, again, I've got to draw attention to those two papers in Science, Moore and Schindler 2022 and Schindler and Hilborg 2015. In the Moore and Schindler paper, they do talk about this, and the value of, for instance, the globe is putting a ton of money into marine protected areas, and that maybe the concept of a static physical space is not necessarily where there won't be strongholds per se as the latitudinal march occurs, right? There may be biogeoclimatic hotspots that promote local diversity, promote local abundance, but that's an ephemeral quantity in the long run. So I think maybe a redefinition of the context of stronghold is important. A stronghold for Pacific salmon was, say, a northern and southern refugium during the last glacial maximum. Whether we can expect that, in going forward under climate change, I think is a bit uncertain.
Yeah, I think the attention to space, given the shifting nature of the northern or higher latitude migration. I'm showing my northern hemisphere bias. Higher latitude migration patterns is real, and so should we be thinking about preserving the resilience of the landscape and the resilience of the species? And the resilience of the species comes from the diversity and the numbers. And so how do we do that? And maybe we need not a place-based management strategy, but a process and species targets for resilience, which again aren't necessarily when we're managing for exploitation. We're not managing for resilience. We'd love some predictability, but we tend to manage for resilience in the yield, not in the and assume that the nature will take care of the resilience in our target population. I think we need to pay more attention to trying to ensure that target population is still there, and that's going to be there because of short of enhancement, captive, making a zoo out of everything, is going to come from that resilience. And I think fisheries is a unique situation, right? This was pointed out by a number of people. This is sort of the last wild animal that as a globe that we pursue for food on a commercial industrial scale. And so we're dependent on natural production. We're not dependent on feedlots and food production of hay in one place that's shipped across the planet for cows someplace else. We're depending on nature to feed us. And so how are we managing the actual natural processes, not just our single species target? Ecosystem-based management, maybe that's, we all would say we'd love to do that. Maybe now we really have to.
Just to add on to that a little bit, I mean, think about as these species shift and we presumably have a shared value. Again, everything I ever deal with in salmon tends to come back to values, and Chris hit the nail on the head earlier on that we need to align values if we want to get anywhere. There is a fair bit of cooperation that happens internationally. NPAFC is an example, even bilateral, US-Canada relations on these things. And again, as they become transient and move, just think of the cooperation that's going to be required to keep them on the planet, let alone, being able to exploit them. So I do believe we're shifting in some ways from an era of large-scale exploitation to conservation by virtue of our own design. What opportunities exist will be, sort of commensurate with how we play together in the sandbox to keep them producing, right? And those two papers again really highlight that necessity that I hope we're there.
Folks, it looks like that is all of the questions we have. Oh, there's one comment. Oh, Dan, someone is requesting that you write down the climate change paper references in the chat so we can have access to those.
Can do.
With that, just a reminder, so October 26th, our 7th seminar on environmental change and salmon productivity in the marine habitat. Again, it will be from 2 to 3 p.m. A huge thank you to our today's speakers, Chris Jordan and Dan Selbie, and a reminder to give appreciation to the steering committee for this PSC Seminar Series, who are doing a great job putting together these monthly seminar. To thank you to Gary Morishima for an introduction and Mickey for helping to moderate this Q&A. Hope you all have a fabulous afternoon, and we'll wrap it up. And if you missed anything or would like to catch it more, we'll be on YouTube. So catch our presentation recording after the fact. So thank you all so much and have a great afternoon.